When you impose sanctions, whether they work or not, the one thing they are absolutely guaranteed to do is foster corruption and black market activity within the target economy.
Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. This week, we are not talking about the Middle East. We're talking about a conference we've held on sanctions at Chatham House, and I really wanted to bring that conversation to this podcast. There are many live examples of sanctions, including those against Russia, Venezuela, Iran, and we're going to be talking about why they're used, when they work, when they fail, and whether they actually end up undermining the countries who are trying to use them, including the US, whether they undermine the dollar and all that. For a long time, sanctions have been the preferred instrument for governments seeking to influence or punish countries or people who are deemed to violate international laws or norms. And the idea is that there needs to be accountability for breaking international law, and that sanctions are a lot better than the use of force. But the fear is that they hit ordinary people and then might fail to achieve the desired results. There are examples of success. Sanctions did contribute to the end of the South African apartheid regime in the 1990s as part of a wider international campaign to bring about change. But in Iraq in the 1990s as well, while they did punish the regime of Saddam Hussein for not complying with weapons inspectors, they did immensely worsen the suffering of Iraq's people. So we're going to plunge into all those questions, when they work and what the downside is of using them. Returning to the podcast is Chris Sabatini, who's our Senior Research Fellow for Latin America with our Americas program. Welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Great to have you here. Also with us is Dan Drezner, Professor of International Politics with the Fletcher School at Tufts University, who's been with us on this week's conference. And I seem to be reading your writing everywhere, Dan. Really good to see you.
I apologize for that, but thank you for having me back.
It is my pleasure. And finally, a warm welcome to Allie Renison, Associate Director at SEC Newgate, who's worked extensively on trade policy within the UK government and with the Institute of Directors. Thanks so much for joining us, Allie.
Thank you.
Good to have you. So let's discuss first what we mean by sanctions, how they work, and a bit about their history. Who'd like to kick us off? I mean, Dan, perhaps would you like to take us into this?
It would be safe to say that sanctions have a pretty long history. The first recorded instance of them was the Athenian boycott of Megara right before the start of the Peloponnesian War. So you're talking more than 2,500 years in terms of history. The modern history of sanctions, though, really starts with the First World War. And that's when the Allied powers essentially institute a set of bureaucracies, organizations, and know-how to try to stop vital goods from getting into Germany or the other Central Powers. Sanctions were championed, obviously, by Woodrow Wilson after the First World War. They were an integral tool of the League of Nations during the interwar period. And then during the Cold War, beyond the U.S. and the Soviet Union sanctioning each other and the South Africa cases you mentioned, not a ton of cases. And really, the key moment is the end of the Cold War, because the end of the Cold War was really the sort of Cambrian moment for sort of flourishing of sanctions. First, because the UN Security Council was more willing to sanction because the U.S. was the last remaining superpower and Russia and China were willing to sign on to certain sanctions. So the UN Security Council actually implemented a whole host of different sanctions regimes. And then second, the sort of globalization of capital markets eventually caused the United States to realize that its control over the dollar could enable it to impose financial sanctions that could really be crippling on a variety of countries and were no doubt in part responsible for forcing Iran to agree to the JCPOA in terms of the nuclear deal back in 2015.
So if there was a golden age of sanctions, when would you say it was?
You mean in terms of their implementation or in terms of their success?
Yes, and I don't mean the Peloponnesian Wars. You would be surprised how often that comes up at Chatham House.
I think you can argue that the golden age was probably immediately after the September 11th terrorist attacks. The passage of the USA Patriot Act enabled the United States to really, for the first time, impose financial sanctions that, due to the nature of capital markets, could be enforced extraterritorially. And so as a result, you saw sanctions imposed on a variety of countries, including countries that had previously thought themselves impervious to sanctions, like, let's say, North Korea. In 2006, the U.S. froze the assets of Banco Delta Asia, a bank that was in Hong Kong. And the North Koreans were not expecting that. And they actually managed to target a bank that held a lot of assets held by the North Korean elite. So this was an instance in which, if you think of sanctions in the same way you think of war in terms of sort of technological improvements really changing the game, as we're thinking about drone warfare or the role that missiles play, the development of targeted financial sanctions really was a significant sort of offensive shift in terms of enabling the U.S. to impose sanctions on a wider variety of actors and ideally to try to obtain concessions. Now, the record is much more mixed there, but it took a while for other states to move down the learning curve in terms of adaptation.
We can pick out some of the details there and what began to go wrong. But as you were talking, I was thinking particularly of the effect that they had on Iran. I think that is one of the powerful examples where it wasn't just shutting out trade with Iran. It was shutting out all kinds of banks and others that might be dealing with other parties who were dealing with Iran. So they really began to have very, very wide effect. Allie, is there something that you've looked at in the past?
Well, I think that in terms of the breadth is quite significant. So in the UK, after we left the EU, we basically created the power for ourselves to create our own sort of standalone sanctions regime that is basically enabled through the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act. But since then, we've had a sort of program of rolling sanctions. There are thematic sanctions that basically look at it, for example, under some of our human rights sort of obligations, and then there are country-specific ones.
By we, you mean the UK?
The UK, yes. And Iran used to be, for example, the most sanctioned country in the world. It's now Russia. If you look at the breadth of some of what applies to it, there are financial sanctions, asset freezes, and these sort of differ in terms of like the responsible authority within government. Obviously, in the UK, sort of the Treasury has sort of OFSI. It's sort of the equivalent to the Office for Foreign Assets Control in the US. And they sort of deal with sort of the operation implementation of sort of financial sanctions, asset freezes, etc. You've got transport sanctions, which are basically bans on the use of UK and European sort of airspace by Russian airlines. That also extends to the ability of Russian-tagged sort of ships to dock in the UK. You've got trade sanctions, economic sanctions that both look at basically both import bans, export restrictions, but also duties. So, for example, one of the things that had, I think, the biggest impact right away in terms of the ability to bring in fertilizer, there was a 35% duty that basically made on bringing in sort of imports of fertilizer from Russia and Belarus, which are some of the biggest providers of fertilizer in the UK. We don't make a huge amount of that at home. So you've got, bans, duties, and other sort of trade sanctions as well.
Let's just unpick a little bit of that. There is, as you're alluding to in a way, a huge industry, or it feels to me huge, of lawyers and financial analysts advising people in London about how to operate with this proliferating network of bans and sanctions and so on. But you're mentioning in there not just bans of the kind you can't trade with China, but also tariffs as well. Do you see those as part of the sanctions regime?
Effectively, they are. If you look at, for example, my old department, the Department of Business and Trade, it operates there's a licensing, basically anyone that wants to try and license things. And there are exemptions provided for example, where, people who are using the sort of financing that has to bring in anything that might have originated from Russia, the Department for Business Trade will operate that as well. But I would include sort of duties in terms of the impact that they are sort of in the sort of sanctions bucket, so to speak. I mean, some people might argue that actually anything that is really an import or an export ban is more in that sort of range. But it's all in the sort of the mix of economic sanctions.
So, Chris, I wonder, and I'm still on this question of when they have worked. We will come on to the failures and the downsides in a moment. But we've got the Iranian example. I referred at the beginning to South Africa, where sanctions clearly played a part amid what was a huge international campaign of opprobrium and censure of all kinds in order to get rid of the apartheid regime. Are there other places where you think that countries getting together and saying we're going to have this particular kind of punishment or pressure, that it has actually had a desired effect?
There are a few success stories. Dan has worked on this, and I'll let him answer this a little bit more detail. Knowing his work, I will, not to steal your thunder, Dan,
No, go ahead.
But, they actually tend to work, oddly enough, most effectively on allied countries. If they're friendly countries, they tend to respond to sanctions. If they're so-called enemy countries, those don't seem to work. In fact, arguably what happens is those regimes become much more entrenched Let's take the case of Cuba, where the U.S. imposed sanctions in 1962 under the Trading with the Enemy Act, and then eventually codified those sanctions in 1992 and 96. They're still in place. It now would take an act of Congress to lift the sanctions on Cuba. And I don't know if anyone's noticed, but it's been 62 years and they haven't done anything yet. It's a policy of regime change, and it hasn't changed. And what makes South Africa successful was that they were broadly conceived and implemented. The Cuba sanctions are unilateral, and unilateral sanctions have a very poor track record.
By that, just to spell it out, you mean the U.S.?
The U.S., yes, exactly. The U.S. is the great sanctioner, by the way. I did a study. There were 400 sanctions by the U.S., U.K., EU, and the UN. There were 400 of those sanctions. The U.S. was overwhelmingly the largest sanctioner.
I'm going to ask Dan about this in a second, but you're still sort of in parenthesis. You're telling us about Cuba.
So I can continue on Cuba, but what effectively happened is that, unlike South Africa, where you had a private sector that did exist, you had a certain global momentum, as you said, opprobrium, criticism. It actually keyed in very nicely to the whole narrative of the global South and freedom and anti-colonialism, which U.S. sanctions on Cuba do the exact opposite. The Castro regime has been very effective in using U.S. sanctions, and its survival under those sanctions is a David and Goliath type story where it's taking on the Yankee imperialists, and it's doing it unilaterally. There's also an interesting thing about the Cuba sanctions, because they really were the first ones where they really tested the limits of extraterritoriality, where if a Spanish hotel company or a Canadian nickel mining company, both real examples, were basically operating or bought property that had been expropriated by the Castro regime, the U.S. could impose jail sentences on the CEOs of those companies. It really set the tone for a lot of the extraterritoriality that we now see that is, getting people their backs up, if you will, about U.S. sanctions, potential overreach, and the weaponization of the dollar, which we hear even from supposed allies like Brazil.
So, Dan, could you pick up this point, the U.S. as the great sanctioner?
Sure, we're the United States of sanctions. The U.S. is, I think, responsible for, by one count during the 20th century, the United States was responsible for approximately 2/3 of all sanctions cases during that history. That actually only intensified in this century, in no small part, again, because the U.S. discovered that it could use its control over the dollar to sort of weaponize the interdependence of capital markets. And the truly liberating thing for Americans was the dollar was so important that the U.S. could impose these sanctions unilaterally without much in the way of multilateral support. The best example of this is the Iran case. When the Obama administration imposed sanctions on Iran in the run-up to the JCPOA, it had UN Security Council resolutions backing it, and it made sure to get European Union buy-in when it originally implemented them. When the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA and reimposed sanctions, it was opposed by just about every other actor, including vociferously by the European Union. And yet the Trump administration sanctions were actually more costly to Iran's economy than what the Obama administration did. Now, I want to stress it didn't lead to any concessions, but nonetheless, this enabled the U.S. to act unilaterally, which made it much easier to impose sanctions.
It arguably not only didn't lead to concessions, but it led to Iran saying, all right, shut us off. We're going to forge ahead with our nuclear weapons program.
Yeah, no, it was an abject failure in terms of both containing Iran's influence within the region and halting Iran's nuclear program. I believe I wrote an article for International Affairs making this exact point entitled How Not to Sanction. So yes, it's a classic failure. I would want to note, though, that while the U.S. has been the most active sanctioner, it's hardly the only one. And increasingly this is changing. The European Union has obviously become more enthusiastic about sanctions. But also, Russia and China are becoming increasingly active, not just as states that are sanctioned, but as states that sanction others. Those sanctions look very different from what the U.S., the U.K., or the EU does. Very often, China is passive-aggressive when it comes to sanctions, where they disrupt exchange but then deny they're disrupting exchange.
Can you just give us a few examples there? Because for a lot of people, that's going to be a novel idea.
One example would be when Liu Xiaobo won the Nobel Peace Prize. China, as you can imagine, that the Chinese government did not take too kindly to that. And then suddenly, mysteriously, Norwegian salmon was blocked from importation into China, ostensibly for health reasons. It was obvious that this was a sanction intended to punish Norway for the fact that the Nobel Prize was awarded to Liu Xiaobo. Similarly, China is engaged in similar actions towards South Korea. When South Korea agreed to install THAAD anti-aircraft missiles in response to North Korea, but China viewed that as a threat. Suddenly, China called for boycotts of South Korean goods and the latte chain of South Korea, which was quite active in China. And so you've seen China and Russia try to use consumer boycotts or do something called conversion, where they take regulations that are not really intended to be for sanctions, but can be weaponized in some ways to function like a sanction, to punish countries that are recalcitrant.
This is really interesting because you're talking about countries, big countries, acting sort of unilaterally, which takes us a long way away from what we were discussing right at the beginning of this, which is a framework of the United Nations Security Council trying to get all kinds of agreement across the world for really breaches of international law, perhaps laws created by the UN Security Council. I mean, Allie, I wondered if I could bring you in, because you spent a lot of time looking at trade and trade rules and whether WTO rules and so on get enforced or not. Do you feel that sanctions are still used in a methodical way, or we really, as Dan is beginning to describe, in a world of much more sort of opportunistic individual
It's
moves?
like a trade war. I mean, what Dan is describing is it sort of lapses into more sort of traditional trade war kind of category. Now, if you look at kind of the way that the UK has done its sanctions, it came out with a strategy to try and pull this all together earlier this year, and it basically called it the sort of disrupt, deter, and demonstrate sort of strategy, which was almost an acknowledgement that, yes, our sanctions are targeted, but we almost implicitly acknowledge that they may not have the desired effect. And what I mean by that is, yes, it will probably disrupt, Russia's war machine to some extent, disrupt Russia's trade flows. But in terms of actually deterring, I don't think it does much deterrence. And it's more of a sort of, and the third pillar of that I thought was interesting was the strategy was it talks about demonstrating our international norms, as if to say, this is a little bit of virtue signaling, but we have to do it in any event.
And on the Russian sanctions at the moment, anyway, I'm thinking of the Turkish finance minister, Mr. Şimşek, who we had at Chatham House at our London conference in the summer, in public, not under the Chatham House rule. And when I asked him, and he was saying how much he backed rules-based trading order, and I asked him, well, look, how about these Russian sanctions, which Turkey is not observing? And he said pretty much word for word, well, look, A, we can't afford to, and B, it doesn't suit us to follow them. And so on this question of the Russian sanctions, do you, Allie, see them having any effect at all?
I think that they have made things that they're doing more costly. It's interesting, there's some discussion about whether we still have a sort of an all-out, effectively embargo on the import of sort of anything to do with Russian oil. There's some loopholes that, based on sort of the way things are shipped, that are supposedly getting around. What Russia has managed to do is basically, and we seem to have adopted a whack-a-mole strategy in response, every time we can find some kind of circumvention. Russia is finding ways to adapt extremely quickly. If you look at their parallel imports regime, which is basically, Apple decided to close up shop in Russia, and yet the newest Apple products are still popping up in Russia. Well, that's because they've expanded what's called the parallel imports regime, which basically allows you to import a good without the authorization of the trademark owner. Normally, this is reserved for medications, pharmaceutical products, but basically Russia's expanded that massively. So they are finding ways to sort of circumvent it. And because, for example, lots of countries, including many developed Western countries, have their own parallel imports regime, it's quite hard to actually say, well, that's illegal. So we're adopting kind of a whack-a-mole approach to try and sort of deal with this sort of circumvention. And the other thing I would add is that one of the things that you notice is, for example, while there's been like a 98% drop in imports from, let's say, Russia to the UK and about an 80 to 85% decrease in sort of exports to Russia, what are the countries where we've seen massive spikes in exports to, rather say, imports from Europe? Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, because there's the Eurasian Economic Union. So trade is certainly being used to help facilitate that circumvention. And it's hard to tackle when it's sort of the origin is a sanctions regime coming into contact with multilateral trade rules.
Various rather elegant graphs around showing just how much Britain is sending to Azerbaijan, which appears to be going to Russia. Before we get on to how they fail, how countries get round them and the dollar, that big question, Chris, I wonder if you could take us into what is the big moral point against sanctions, which is that they can hurt an awful lot of ordinary people, make their lives much more miserable while failing to achieve the desired effect.
I've never quite understood the working policy hypothesis of sanctions, especially when it comes to regime change. More economic sanctions are understood, but broad-based sanctions, and the U.S. has them on Syria, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, Russia, obviously. When it comes to regime change in Russia, in the case of the U.S. sanctions on Russia, I think we've rejiggered a little bit of the goals in ways that much more manageable. As we heard recently, the Secretary was talking about trying to impair Russia's war-making ability. But in these broader cases, what happens is that, yes, people lose access to goods and services. They lose, especially in the case of, let's say, Cuba, which doesn't produce much food. Food is a real concern. When there are allowances for Cuba to import food, but they're very onerous to try to get around. And so, first of all, the unintended consequences on overall poverty and decline of standard of living. Shortly after the U.S. imposed the sanctions on Venezuela, we saw massive outflow of migration. We've talked about this, Bronwen, where 20% of the population has left Venezuela. The economy has cratered so much that 2/3 of GDP has shrunk. Now, part of that is Venezuela's own economic mismanagement.
Incredible numbers.
Yes. First of all is the population. There's a second unintended consequence that has to do with the political economy that's created out of sanctions. And, when, for example, in Russia, when Western companies pulled out, basically Putin seized all those companies and redistributed McDonald's and Starbucks and others to all of his cronies. So it led to the concentration of economic and his political power along those lines. So there's also that element as well. So you don't have the sort of broad-based wealth. You don't have sort of the wealth-generating capacities by owning a Starbucks. It simply becomes much more crony capitalism.
All right. So what about sanctioning those individuals, which also is one of the things people try and do with sanctions?
It's a different kettle of fish. I also think it's been overused. There are several hundred individual sanctions in Central America right now that the U.S. has. And again, it only sanctions weak countries. So the individual sanctions in Central America or Latin America are on Paraguay, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador. Nothing against Argentina, nothing against Brazil. It is a weapon of the strong against the weak, which may be more targeted. It's intended to address issues of corruption. These are now generally called Magnitsky sanctions after the dissident who died in prison in Russia. These are intended to sort of punish individuals for being engaged in human rights violations as well as being engaged in corruption. They may be more effective. They basically effectively seize the assets of these individuals and limit their ability to travel to the United States. That may have an effect. But again, they're being applied so promiscuously. Just recently, the former president of Haiti was Martelly was sanctioned, and he celebrated that. So they even have become sort of the butt of jokes among many of the targets.
And you raise a really important point. I was taking part in a debate in one of the Inns of Court against Bill Browder, whose lawyer, Magnitsky, then was killed by the Russians. He was not at that point a dissident. He was a lawyer acting for Bill Browder. And it gave rise to this. And I was expressing a real unease that the US, helped by Bill Browder, might develop lists of people it didn't like or thought to be sanctioned. And in this very personal way, these things would be developed.
The problem, too, is in these cases, there's no due process. It is, I think they can be used effectively, but they should be wielded very carefully because individuals don't know what evidence is being brought against them. They're often cooked up, not in secret, but a lot of the evidence is hidden from view. It isn't clear how they get themselves removed from these lists. So there are real problems in terms of the rule of law in the application of these Magnitsky sanctions.
It's interesting you say that. I think someone once described it to me that when it comes to kind of sort of sanctions regime, particularly around sort of individual persons, it's a kind of an all bets are off in terms of being able to anticipate sort of the methodology behind it.
So let's go to our final point, really, which is about not only how they fail and how people or countries begin to get around them, but what that does to the ability of the world to use sanctions. And Dan, I wonder if you could reflect on this. This is something that you've written a lot about, but is it really undermining the whole principle of sanctions and indeed undermining the US and the dollar?
So I have a mixed answer here. Are sanctions undermining the use of the dollar? In the end, probably not, or only a little. Which is to say, there's no denying that the recent sanctions cases have caused countries like Russia and China to try to denominate their trade and to try to invoice their trade in currencies other than the dollar, namely the renminbi, and to refrain from using dollars in terms of cross-border transactions. Does that weaken the dollar status as a reserve currency? A little bit, but not too much, because the primary thing that's going to determine the dollar's status is not really official Chinese flows or official Russian flows, but rather what private wealth in the West is going to do. And for a whole variety of reasons, they prefer the dollar strongly to any other alternative. And that's the real problem, is that for all of the inconveniences that sanctions impose on the dollar, there is no natural alternative that is in any way appealing to most privately held wealth in the world. So while there's no denying that the United States has probably abused its status a little bit in terms of the centrality of the dollar, it has not abused it so much that you're really seeing a desperate search by countries other than Russia for an alternative. Now, in terms of whether sanctions are being abused too much or being used so much that they undermine their own success, here what I would say is that one of the problems with sanctions that I honestly don't think policymakers have entirely come to grips with yet is that when you impose sanctions, whether they work or not, the one thing they are absolutely guaranteed to do is foster corruption and black market activity within the target economy. Because sanctions are essentially an effort to outlaw what would otherwise be ordinary market activity. This creates an incentive for a whole variety of actors to engage in various black market and gray market activities to essentially earn above average profits. The problem is that even when you lift the sanctions, all of those corruption networks stay in place and they don't want to go away. And so as a result, there are countries that are NATO members, countries like Montenegro, that could argue their entire political economy was based on sanctions avoidance. And so this creates real problems down the road in terms of bringing these countries back into the international community, because a country that has faced a long period of sanctions winds up seeing such a distorted political economy domestically that it is really hard, even if sanctions are lifted, to become an economy that, let's say, more closely resembles the OECD countries.
And it also consolidates sort of diverted trade flows so that, in theory, sanctions are supposed to be temporary. The reality is, and we now have a new term for them, they're rolling sanctions, is that if the trade flows have enabled and encouraged relations between, let's say, for example, Russia would like you to believe that there's much more activity between the BRICS. I'm not sure Brazil would entirely agree. Well, then when the sanctions are lifted, those economic relationships have been forged. They've been sort of backed up by sort of political engagement. It's quite hard to sort of see that once those trade flows have been diverted, that there's any encouragement to sort of bring them back, apart from the fact that basically, let's say, UK or sort of Western trade with Russia has been completely excoriated. That part is permanent, but it's also had this sort of diverted effect in terms of consolidating trade flows between Russia and other countries that didn't necessarily exist, maybe politically, but certainly economically in the scale that they do now.
And that is a very powerful argument, it seems to me. Chris, I'm going to give the last word on this to you, and you were nodding enormously when Dan was talking about corruption, but about the unwanted consequences of sanctions and the ones that get baked into the system. Where do you think we are now?
Yeah, I think we're in a very dangerous spot. Let's take the case of Venezuela, where maximum pressure sanctions were imposed by the Trump administration in 2019. Several things happened there. First of all, you see this cooperation among Iran, Russia, Venezuela, and China to help Venezuela both process its oil, because it has a particularly sticky, heavy crude, so it needs diluents to process it. Iran was providing those. Iran, North Korea, China were all helping ship the oil. You've seen a dramatic spike in illegal gold mining. You've seen narcotics also. If you look at sort of any DEA maps of narcotics flights out of Colombia, they're all either leaving from Venezuela or flying over. So there's that, but also, when they imposed the sanctions in 2019, they also imposed secondary sanctions. And what those secondary sanctions did was they prohibited the trading of Venezuela's defaulted debt, $160 billion worth of defaulted debt. They prohibited trading among Western companies. Who bought the bonds? Russia and China. And so when it comes time to renegotiate Venezuela's debt, whenever that happens, Russia and China are going to have a seat at the table. So in other words, that debt crisis and future debt crises are going to look a heck of a lot different today than they did in the 1980s. Because you've got seriously malign actors, and Russia also owns a lot of the oil fields right now in the Orinoco Belt, which is a oil-rich area of Venezuela. They have a sizable chunk of real estate and bonds in Venezuela. They're going to be there for good.
So what the three of you have been describing is, all right, from the beginning, Dan took us right back to the beginning, when it was a tool of the United Nations Security Council. But now in what is a bitterly divided world, and one getting more starkly divided, we're seeing sanctions exacerbate a lot of that. Now, some of that may be because the US has overplayed its hand in using them, but also because they, as we've all been discussing, they go on and begin to cement these new relationships. We are going to have to stop there, but I was thinking thinking, particularly as Dan was talking, about some work that one of our colleagues, David Lubin, is doing on the dollar. And yes, everyone agrees there is no easy alternative to the dollar at the moment. But a senior financial leader in the city said to me the other day, the US political system is giving the world many reasons to look for alternatives to the dollar. And our discussion just emphasizes that as well. Huge thank you to Allie Renison, Dan Drezner, Chris Sabatini. Do follow them all on X, and you can also obviously find Chatham House there. All the details are in the show notes. We have a huge week ahead at Chatham House. Nancy Pelosi, big figure in American politics, the first woman to serve as Speaker of the US House of Representatives, will be here. Also with us is Valery Zaluzhny, the former Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's armed forces, and now the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK. All those details again on chathamhouse.org. And for now, a reminder that you can listen to all the episodes of Independent Thinking on all major podcast platforms, as well as through our social media. So please do like, follow, subscribe, and leave us the reviews that we do read. With really busy weeks coming up, I'm not going to mention the American election again. Goodbye from me, Bronwen Maddox. See you next week.